Well, we still have some folks joining us, but I want to get us started today. Welcome to the Saint Anselm College Center for Ethics and Society. My name is Kyle Hubbard, and welcome to today's Ethics and Governance Investor Education Forum, Bitcoin and Blockchain, the Age of Decentralized Ledgers. The mission of the Center for Ethics and Society is to enrich the knowledge and practice of principled ethical decision-making by addressing important social and organizational issues through collaborative research, discussion, and education. In light of this mission, we're particularly excited to have Douglas Pepe with us today to help us understand and begin to evaluate the world of cryptocurrency, a world of which I admit I am almost entirely ignorant. Today's event is the latest installment in the Ethics and Governance Forum. Funding for the Ethics and Governance programs comes from a $2 million endowment created by the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office and the Center for Public Responsibility and Corporate Citizenship, awarded to Saint Anselm College in 2013. The endowment was created from a settlement reached between the New Hampshire Securities Bureau and Tyco International Limited in 2002, and is administered by the University of New Hampshire Foundation. So we thank you for their support. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and as well as the moderator for today's discussion. Our speaker is, as you can see on the slide, Douglas J. Pepe, who teaches blockchain law and policy at the George Washington University School of Law in Washington, D.C., and is a partner at the New York litigation firm Joseph Haghe Aaronson, where he practices in the field of complex commercial litigation. In addition to his active law practice, Doug is the founder of Mango Farm Assets and Ravencoin IPFS, which recently merged with IP Assets, a company he co-founded to provide software and tools for tokenizing real-world assets and NFTs on the blockchain. He's also the inventor of a patent-pending blockchain voting system and other blockchain-related software and hardware products, including the Ice Wallet cold storage system for Ravencoin assets. Doug serves on the board of the Ravencoin Foundation and speaks and writes regularly on blockchain and other legal issues. He's a member of the American Law Institute and a fellow of the Litigation Council of America. Welcome, Doug. Our moderator during the Q&A will be my colleague, Professor Stephan Unger. Stephan, also as you can see on the screen, is an associate professor of economics and business at Saint Anselm College. He studied at Vienna University of Economics and Business and worked full-time for a brokerage firm. After graduating, he started working in the markets and investment banking division of UniCredit as a corporate fixed income structurer for several years. He then completed his doctorate at Vienna University of Economics and Business while attending the London Graduate School of Mathematical Finance at Imperial College London. He is the CEO of an algorithmic FX trading company which specializes in automated trading systems, as well as a member of the World Energy Council and board member of the Young Energy Professionals program of the World Energy Council, Austria. Welcome, Stephan. So before I turn it over to our speaker, let me give you some instructions about the Q&A and how this will run. After our speaker is finished and our moderator has asked a couple of questions to get us going, you may simply ask a question by raising your hand with the raise hand feature down at the bottom of Zoom, the Zoom screen there. And Stephan will call on you, at which point you may unmute yourself and ask the question. Right now you are muted automatically, so everyone's full attention can be on Doug. You may also write your questions in the chat using the chat function at the bottom of the screen at any point during the presentation or afterwards, and Stephan will monitor those and try to ask as many of those as he can. Due to the number of people on the call today, we probably can't get to everyone's questions, so bear with us. So just one last reminder, this program is being recorded and will be posted on the center's website after the event. So if you speak during the Q&A, you will be on the recording, so just know that. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way, please welcome me in joining Doug Pepe.
Thank you very much, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be here. I really love speaking about blockchain and educating as much as I can. Hopefully, not a lot of you have a great deal of information or background in blockchain, because this discussion will be sort of putting blockchain in a bit of a historical context and walking through that history, sort of explaining blockchain at sort of a high level so that you can get a basic understanding of it. We can, in the question and answer session, we can go as deep as anyone, on the Zoom call wants to go. So I'll start by sharing my screen, and hopefully that will work just fine. Okay, can everyone see that? Great. So the topic of my discussion is Bitcoin and blockchain, the age of decentralized ledgers. And I want to start out with a bit of historical background. And I noticed that there are a few Ravencoiners here in the audience. I'm on the board of the Ravencoin Foundation. Tron Black, who serves on the board with me, is also in the Zoom call. I saw others, Pathfinder and others. I apologize in advance to you guys because you've seen some of these slides before, but I think they're important slides to give people a general background on blockchain. So let's start with a little bit of history. Who in the audience, and you can raise your hand, I can see those of you who are on video, who's ever heard of this person? Do you know who this person is? Yeah, no, nobody knows who it is. This is one of the most important historical figures in the financial world, and nobody has really ever heard of him. His name's Father Luca Pacioli. He was born in 1447 and died in 1517. He was a classic Renaissance man, a friar, and he was actually Leonardo da Vinci's math teacher, and a very, very smart man. But that's not really what makes him important. What makes him important is that he is known as the father of modern accounting. So, what does a Renaissance friar have to do with blockchain? In 1494, Pacioli systematized the concept of a ledger, double entry bookkeeping. It's a pretty dry subject. I am actually interested in it. My mother was a CPA, but most people aren't fascinated by T accounts. But understanding cryptocurrencies begins with the concept of a ledger. And if you sort of look around at the world, at the financial world today, Pacioli's ledgers are the building blocks of financial transaction recording everywhere. And they're literally everywhere in modern society. So let's talk about an example of that. This is a hypothetical person named Marty. And Marty wants to send a $100 check to his friend Jennifer for Jennifer's birthday. Now, what is that? That's just a piece of paper. It represents dollars, but it isn't a dollar. It isn't a $100 bill. It's a piece of paper that says pay to the order of. Jennifer takes that check and deposits that check in her bank. And through a series of Pacioli ledgers, $100 is transferred from Marty to Jennifer. Those are just entries. They're debits and credits on a system of ledgers in the banking system. And in fact, our entire banking system in the modern world is based on and is in fact only one giant system of Pacioli ledgers. But in the post-financial crisis world, that raises a question, right? Is there a problem with our ledgers? Money, when you break it down, is really just an unsecured obligation on a bank ledger. It's an IOU. And in fact, only a fraction of our money sits in the bank. We have a fractional reserve banking system. So, you may go to the vault and say, please give me my funds, but only 10% or less of the funds that you deposited are sitting in the bank. And the bank system is subject to failure. Banks fail all the time, particularly post 2008 during the financial crisis, but which are the examples that I've given here. But banks regularly fail. We have systems to protect against that, to protect against bank runs. We have the FDIC that insures up to a deposit threshold. But in reality, all of the money that is sloshing around our system isn't really money. It's an entry on a Pacioli ledger reflecting money that doesn't exist. And modern economics is basically an experiment in monetary debasement. I've got here, a chart of the M1 money supply. And if you look, I plotted this chart from the date of my birth in July of 1974 to 2008 to show it up to the financial crisis. This doesn't include the recent post-COVID events and the increase in the money supply that resulted. But if you look at what's gone on with our money, the money supply has increased and increased and increased and increased every year. Now, when you measure that money against something hard, an asset, right? Assets go up in value in relation to the dollar because the dollar itself has become debased. So what does this have to do with blockchain? Right in the middle of the financial crisis on October 31st, 2008, a person came on the scene by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto. Satoshi is the inventor of Bitcoin. And the interesting thing is, we don't really know who Satoshi Nakamoto is. It's a pseudonym. We don't know if Satoshi's a man or a woman. We don't know if Satoshi's a group. No idea. But Satoshi's identity isn't really what's important. What's important is what Satoshi did. And Satoshi's discovery or invention is literally revolutionary. And what is that revolutionary discovery? It's called Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin? At its most basic level, Bitcoin was the first solution to a previously intractable problem. And that problem is, how can you record a financial transaction between two people or any sort of message between two people without a centralized, trusted third party to keep that ledger? If I were to go back to prior screens, you would see each of the individual banks has their ledger, and those banks have clearing banks, and it trickles its way up all through the Federal Reserve to what I had described as the big Fed ledger, which is sort of a net settlement system for our nation's money. The Fed ledger is kept by a trusted institution. That trusted institution is required under the Pacioli ledger system to maintain the database or the ledger of financial transactions. Prior to Satoshi coming on the scene in October of 2008, no system for electronic transfers or paper transfers of value or wealth had ever existed that would allow two people to interact with each other and to send value from one person to another without a trusted third party to keep that ledger. And so when you look at the growth of intermediaries in our financial system, you will see, everything from Western Union to Citibank to PayPal to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, those are ledger keepers. Satoshi made that ledger, that centralized ledger concept, superfluous. And the way that Satoshi did it was by devising a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash that allows online payments to be sent directly from one person to another without going through a financial institution. And this is the magic of blockchain. This is why blockchain adds value to the world, because it's the first ledger that allows you to do that in the history of humanity. Historically, we did have an example of a decentralized ledger. It's called gold. It's not an electronic ledger, but there is a limited supply of gold in the world. And whether you're a nation state or a person with a piece of gold displaying your wealth on your finger, you have a fraction of that total world supply. So gold can actually be thought of as the sort of ancient version of a decentralized ledger. No one needs to record how much gold I have on my finger. It's there. And that's my fraction of the total gold supply in the world. And in fact, when nations were on the gold standard, that's one sort of reason that nations adopted a gold standard, was because gold was a store of value that nations could hold that didn't require the trust of another nation. We've since sort of gone away from that system. But Satoshi's solution was a peer-to-peer electronic value storage and transmission system. So Bitcoin, for everything you have heard, everything you've read in the papers, at bottom, it's just a ledger. But unlike the ledgers that you know today, those Pacioli ledgers, Satoshi's ledger requires no trust. There's no third party in between the transactions that is required. This new ledger is called a blockchain. And what a blockchain does is it replaces that trust element with mathematics, cryptography. And so Satoshi was the first person to make that type of system work. And I'll explain a little bit how. So using Satoshi's solution, Marty, in our example, can use Satoshi's ledger to send value to Jennifer without trusting anyone in between. And their transaction is locked cryptographically on the blockchain forever. And that's done by a decentralized network of computers called miners. You may have heard about Bitcoin mining. That's what miners do. Miners record transactions on the blockchain. They timestamp transactions on the blockchain in a trustless and a decentralized way. So what does this, and let me just back up for a second. You know, what is Bitcoin? Why does this Bitcoin thing have value? And we'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail, but you know, I want to give you a sort of a preface to it. Bitcoin, like any other asset, has value because we value it. And the reason we value it is because of these properties. It has limited supply. There will only be 21 million Bitcoin ever in existence. Some of them have been lost to history by those who lost the private keys to be able to spend them. But you know, there's a max cap of 21 million Bitcoin that will ever exist. And they exist on this decentralized system that allows people to do peer-to-peer transactions without a trusted third party. Those properties, that's what gives Bitcoin value. And you know, as you see over time, the more and more people get involved in Bitcoin, the more and more people hold Bitcoin, the more and more people use Bitcoin, the higher and higher the value of Bitcoin goes, because it's being used, and the properties of Bitcoin make it a worthwhile vehicle for storing and transacting value. But at the end of the day, what a Bitcoin is just a little piece of code. It's a message. It's a message that says, it's called a UTXO. It's a message that says, okay, I'm Marty and I'm sending 1 Bitcoin to Jennifer. And that transaction, that UTXO, gets mined onto the Bitcoin network, gets reposited in these decentralized nodes, this database that resides everywhere on different decentralized nodes. And once that's done, it becomes an immutable record of Marty's transfer of that little bit of code to Jennifer. We imbue that code with value. And the reason we imbue that code with value is because it's got the valuable properties of being able to transact on a decentralized basis. So what does this mean for us? I call it the blockchain revolution. And you know, when I first started to use this phrase, you know, it's almost laughable, right? To say this, we have a blockchain revolution coming. Well, we're in the middle of it now. You're starting to see institutions adopt Bitcoin. You're starting to see more and more people using Bitcoin. And you know, I want you to close your eyes and imagine a world where you control your own money, not banks. You don't need to ask permission from a bank to give you your money back. You don't need to ask permission of a bank to send your money to someone else, because that's the system we currently have. Your deposits in a bank are maintained on a fractional basis. And we're at a zero reserve environment right now, so there really aren't any fractional reserve. And you have basically an unsecured obligation sitting on that bank's balance sheet. An unsecured obligation, at the end of the day, isn't an asset. It's the right to sue if you ask for it and the person that holds it doesn't give it back. As a litigator, I know this well, and I did litigate financial crisis cases where large institutions wouldn't give the money back that was owed in the middle of the financial crisis, resulting in, you know, the demise of several significant financial institutions. So imagine a world where you control your own money and where governments can't erode your wealth by printing money back by debt, a world without inflation, or a world where you can control the degree to which you are participating in an inflationary monetary system by holding an asset, an appreciating asset like Bitcoin. A world where you can store your money on a piece of paper, on a thumb drive, or on a phone, and send it almost instantly to anyone, anywhere in the world, at any time. Now, you know, 4 years ago or 5 years ago, a lot of people needed to sort of envision that world or imagine that world. We don't need to envision it anymore. We live in it. In fact, you know, Bitcoin is being used now as the monetary instrument in nation states. El Salvador is an example that just went on the Bitcoin standard in tandem with a US dollar standard a few months ago. So that's Bitcoin, and that's blockchain. And just to summarize, it's a ledger, but unlike Pacioli's ledgers, it's a ledger that requires no trust. But that ledger can be used for other things. And that's where it really starts to get interesting, right? Bitcoin is just a value transfer mechanism. But the same concept can be used for other assets, real world assets, intangibles, tangible property, your car. If you think about all of the things that are actually in your life that are reposited on a ledger, it's pretty, mind-boggling to think of. And everything from your birth is recorded on a ledger, your marriage is recorded on a ledger, your car is recorded on a ledger, your passport, your title to your house is recorded on a ledger, your securities, all of them. So, there are really unlimited possibilities for the application of this decentralized peer-to-peer ledger concept that go way beyond sort of money and finance. Use cases are about as broad as your imagination: voting systems, securities, record keeping, artwork, patents, music streaming, wills and trusts. Think about what the patent office is, the USPTO. It's a ledger keeper. It's a trusted ledger keeper. It's not necessary anymore. Now, whether those systems ultimately, trend towards a blockchain solution, we don't know. But what I can tell you is the need for that centralized type of record keeping no longer exists post 2008, now that we have this decentralized way to exchange. Music streaming, chain of title, housing titles, big data storage, basically anything that you can put on a database or a ledger, you can put on the blockchain now. So I'll give you an example. It's one that I work with a lot. I'm a big enthusiast of the Ravencoin blockchain. You'll see this is the white paper for the Ravencoin blockchain. One of the audience members here is Tron Black, who is on this white paper. Ravencoin it allows you to take Satoshi's ledger, the same concept of those UTXOs that are going from person to person on a decentralized basis. But you can create and transfer interests in real world, tangible and intangible property. Like Bitcoin, it's trustless and immutable, and it allows you to store and transact ownership, legal rights on these things called blockchain assets. So what is a blockchain asset? They can be almost anything, right? So think about commodities or securities or real estate, things that require title transfer, basically any asset in the world. Art, which is one thing that's sort of hitting the space in a fairly large way as we're speaking. And Ravencoin allows you to bind legal ownership of that real world asset with the blockchain using your jurisdiction's legal requirements. And Alice, our friend Alice, can use this blockchain ledger to transact in the real world assets on a trustless basis, just like Alice was able to send a Bitcoin to Bob. And her transaction, like a Bitcoin transaction, is cryptographically secured through a decentralized network of miners, just like Bitcoin. So that's how Ravencoin works. Ravencoin is not the only blockchain asset tokenization platform. It's one that I work with. There are several others. But if you see the trend, the trend is going in the direction of, first starting with value, and then moving on to other types of assets. Right now, there are assets called NFTs. You might have heard of them. They're called non-fungible tokens. They're basically pieces of art that are put on the blockchain, and people are trading them, like trading cards. Not a lot of substance to an NFT, but take that concept and expand it out. Now you're not talking about NFTs anymore. You're talking about securities, or you're talking about even foreign exchange receipts, anything you can think of. So think of the trusted ledgers that will, if these types of decentralized systems are adopted, that will become superfluous. And I've named a few here: the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. That's the centralized ledger keeper for securities. CLS, that is a bank that exists. Most people have never heard of it. Not all, much of the financial foreign exchange transactions that occur in the world clear through CLS. And the reason they clear through CLS is because there was a bank in Germany that failed, and it's called Herstatt risk. CLS eliminates the settlement risk that you would otherwise have without a trusted banking intermediary. So institutions become sort of part of the CLS banking system, and they clear their trades, their FX trades through CLS. Not necessary if you have a system that net settles on an instantaneous basis without a trusted third party. And that's what the Bitcoin ledger allows you to do. Think of the number of ledger keepers on Wall Street, the Options Clearing Corporation, MERS. I've got a picture here of the county clerk, right? Those books in the county clerk's office with deeds recorded in them, some of them handwritten from the 1700s, they're not necessary anymore. Because when you transact on the blockchain, everyone can look at the blockchain, examine it, and audit the blockchain without needing a trusted third party to keep those books. There's actually a company right now that is doing exactly this for several counties in the West, putting their land deeds and transactions on the blockchain, on the Ravencoin blockchain. I believe it's on the Flow blockchain. So CME Group, others. So, I want to end this by saying we now live in an age of the decentralized ledger. It hasn't been used for all of our systems, and it may not be used for some time for all of our systems, but it's here and it's not going away. So, my prediction is, and I get stronger and stronger in this prediction over time. My prediction is that at some point in time, in the next, say, 20 or 25, 30 years, everything, all material transactions are going to be put on the blockchain. And think about the repercussions of that for all of those trusted institutions, these major institutions, the big buildings. I'm looking out of my window. I live in New Jersey. My office is in New York, there's a screen behind me of my office. I look over into New York. I look at Wall Street. I look at downtown Manhattan, and I see, all of these massive buildings that are built around the notion of trusted intermediaries recording transactions between people. They are no longer necessary. So, as I look forward to the future, and I use my imagination, I see a future in which this blockchain ledger concept that Satoshi invented, this anonymous person invented in 2008, I see it trending towards the system that we use that will replace the Pacioli ledger that we've been using since the 1400s. So that's my presentation, and I think we're going to open it up to questions now, and I would love it if the audience, after we've got some questions from Stephan, I would love it if we got some questions from the audience. Don't assume that you don't need to have any knowledge about blockchain. Ask away. So thank you all for your time. Thank you for listening, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Stephan to start asking some questions.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Pepe. That's awesome that you did this real interesting general presentation and insights. So what I would like to ask you, I would just like to continue actually on the repercussions you were mentioning at the end. So I would like to come up with 3 general questions, which might be also of interest to the audience before we open it up to the general questions.
Sure.
The first question I would like to ask you is how likely you actually think that it is that we will come up with, or we will see, a decentralized monetary system in general, because I highly doubt that the central banks will just stand on the sideline and watch the business being taken away. As you might know, there are attempts being made, like with the RS coin, to introduce centralized ledgers. Right. So this would be one question of concern, my first one.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't think we need to envision that world. And I'm not quite sure that world will ever exist, because countries want to control their money supply for various reasons. But that doesn't mean that this type of system doesn't make sense for people to use. When you break down Bitcoin, what it really is, it's a decentralized value storage system that allows me to send value to somebody else. It's got properties that sort of maintain the value when you have an increasing monetary supply that debases hard assets. Bitcoin is a hard asset like gold, and that type of asset can peacefully coexist with an inflationary monetary system. It's the measuring stick. So as you get monetary debasement with fiat currency, right? As a user, I have the option. I can buy a Picasso, which tend to go up in value over time as we get inflation. I can buy a Bitcoin. I can buy a brick of gold. the properties that make these things good stores of value, really, they're not dependent on sort of what financially economists do, and monetary economists do in the Federal Reserve. In fact, it really is the value proposition of having a sort of a hard asset that people can put their fiat currency into, and hopefully over time, as fiat currency begins to debase by 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 10, 19% a year, depending upon whether you're talking about the 70s or today. As the monetary instrument debases over time, hopefully you will get more of it when you transact back from Bitcoin into the monetary instrument. So I don't think Bitcoin needs to supplant. And many people talk about a Bitcoin standard. I don't think it's necessary. I think Bitcoin serves a function, a valuable function in society, even without it being a sort of a central bank standard that's used, like the gold standard was.
Okay, thanks a lot. Maybe I can jump on this at the end, what you said, with my other question regarding the value of Bitcoin or blockchain-based coins, basically. One assumption behind this is that the value that's being stored or what it's based upon is somehow described through the energy that's being put in the system for mining, for example.
Right.
Now, as we know, we face a problem in general of limited resources and energy shortages, actually, in Europe and all over the world, actually. And so isn't this a conflict of interest somehow to promote the emergence of this centralized or decentralized ledgers, where more and more energy will be necessary to maintain such a system, while we face the problem of having less and less energy available?
Right. So I have a couple of answers to that. First, I just want to be clear. I do not believe personally, and there are a lot of people who study this, but I do not personally believe that the value of Bitcoin comes from the energy that is used directly, comes from the energy that's used to mine Bitcoin. That's very much a labor theory of value type of analysis, and I don't personally adhere to it. Indirectly, the amount of energy that's used, the hash power that is used to secure the Bitcoin network, enhances the properties that make it a good value store, and thereby increase demand. So I don't think it's a supply side sort of labor theory of value mechanism that causes increased hash rate to increase the value of Bitcoin. So I just wanted to put a pin in that and make sure that I was clear about it. Electricity usage, right? So we use electricity for lots of things that some things some people may consider to be frivolous, right? I use ice in my drinks when I drink a Diet Coke, and refrigeration uses a heck of a lot more energy than Bitcoin does. I mean, in a free market, energy will flow to the highest and best use. And if we find ourselves in an economy where we, as a group of individuals, because that's what Bitcoin is, it's individuals using code. If a group of individuals, decide that this type of peer-to-peer transfer system is economically more efficient for them, and it's a good use of electricity, then it is in fact a good use of electricity in comparison to others. So, the market will equilibrate the, electricity usage and the electricity price to the highest and best use. And the more electricity that gets used, the higher the price will go. And if the price goes higher, people will use less of it. Now, and this may be getting too much into the weeds of some economic theory, but Bitcoin is actually one of the, there's a saying that, Bitcoin is the purchaser of last resort for electricity. A lot of Bitcoin mining farms are finding their way to utilize excess electricity that wouldn't otherwise be put on the grid, would just be flamed off and wasted. It's pretty interesting. I've never personally studied it, but you hear a lot of folks in the Bitcoin space talk about this. And I'm not quite sure that all of the electricity usage that we attribute to Bitcoin is actually electricity that would have been used for a positive purpose. The system, the incentives in the system are to reduce electricity costs as much as possible and use renewable sources of energy. So you're starting to see things like, in China, you saw Bitcoin mines pop up around hydroelectric. And in El Salvador, you're seeing a $1 billion project that's being, bonds are being floated on the blockchain, by the way, to create a volcano mining facility that sits next to a volcano that uses the volcano energy to generate Bitcoin transactions through mining. So, I actually think Bitcoin might have a positive trend as it relates to energy usage, because it's directing the energy usage to build facilities that are utilizing renewable resources. It's an economic incentive to create that next to the volcano mining farm that otherwise wouldn't exist. That next to the volcano electricity generation facility would not exist economically for making ice cubes. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, so it basically incentivizes innovation.
It incentivizes, renewable electricity for sure. And you see it all over the place in the space. If you follow the space, you see people even put on Twitter, they put a new mine up next to a natural gas flaming facility, capturing the natural gas that would otherwise be flamed out into the atmosphere, capture it, use it for Bitcoin mining, and make money out of it.
Okay, thanks a lot. My last question, there are already some questions popping in the text. My third question, actually, my last question, covers this partially, which is about the security and privacy concerns related with the centralized or decentralized ledgers. So what can actually be traced, tracked? Because one characteristics of the system is that you can't, once you have a record on the ledger, it can't be taken out anymore.
Right.
But is it really 100% safe? So that's question number one. Then the second question is, what are the implications of that for the society in general, and so on?
It's a really important question. It's one we talk about a lot in my class, and there are trade-offs. So let's start with this. We talked about the Bitcoin ledger, okay? And one of the important characteristics of the Bitcoin ledger is that it's fully auditable by anyone that has that code. Anyone that has a Bitcoin full node, which you can download, you can put it on a device like this and run a Bitcoin full node. You personally can audit every transaction that ever occurred, the full set of transactions from the date that Bitcoin was launched in January of 2009 to today. But that has privacy implications, because now Bitcoin transactions are sent from person to person, not through their names. It's sent through a string of letters and numbers called a Bitcoin address. So you can send Bitcoin to someone's address, sort of like a numbered account. And there's cryptography behind those addresses that sort of underlies how the system works. But those addresses, if those addresses can be tied to a person's IP address or tied to a person's identity, then it opens up a whole door for tracking and tracing financial transactions that go on the Bitcoin network. And there's danger in that. We've come to a place in society in America, particularly post 9/11, where we're getting more and more comfortable, I think, there's some of the folks in the audience, probably lived through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. During that era, people were, I think, more concerned than they are today about keeping their information private. We've given up a lot of privacy in the information space to companies in Silicon Valley, and where the business model of the entity is to absorb your information and sell it. We've gotten comfortable with that because we like free stuff, and that's what we get. Google's free. The cost of using Google is that Google absorbs your information like a vacuum cleaner and sells it to third parties. Now, when you're talking about finance, though, it's a little bit different. I think people still want to maintain some semblance of privacy in their financial transactions. And what's going on in the regulatory space, and I know this isn't a legal talk, but what's going on in the regulatory space right now is that, outside of individuals running these nodes themselves, these peer-to-peer nodes, regulators are stepping in and saying each of the on-ramps, each of the, equivalents of the bank in the Bitcoin space, Coinbase, other entities that allow people to buy and sell Bitcoin, they have to gather and store your information and make it available to the government. So from that point, when you know that I, Doug Pepe, am the person who has, let's say, one Bitcoin in this address, you can trace, and maybe the next person, the Bob, I'm the Alice in this example, and the Bob has a Bitcoin address, and that's been tied to their identity through another institution using this KYC, know your customer regulatory requirement. Then once you start to identify all of the individuals in the system by their addresses, you can track and trace basically the entire economy. Now, that's not sort of where Bitcoin is right now, but it is, as years go on and on and on, there are companies, the sole function of which is to identify individuals and structure Bitcoin transactions to help identify who the actual real world actors are in the system. There are privacy coins that have a little bit of a different model and use sort of complex cryptography to shield the source and the recipient of transactions. That's one sort of model that has grown up to address this. There are issues with those kinds of coins. It's just a different type of system. And then if you go to the extreme, you go to a situation where we have central bank digital currencies, right? So in the United States of America, I don't have a great deal of fear, although I don't love it. A government issued central bank digital currency, we still have protections like the Fourth Amendment, and we do have reasonable expectations of privacy, at least in some sense, in the financial space. So the government won't have a godlike view, an Uber. I don't know if you ever heard of Uber's God view. A godlike view of all the participants in the system. But that's in the United States of America. Imagine China, okay, which is now currently adopting a central bank digital currency, building it out. When you have programmable and traceable money, and you tie that money to someone's identity, you can stop them. What if I want to buy a book that happens to be a book that the regime doesn't like? Can they stop me from using my money to buy that book? Of course they can. That's what programmable money allows you to do. If I use my money to fund an opposition party, can the government then beat down my door with whatever the Chinese equivalent of a warrant is? Of course they can. So there is a real concern here, and it's that this technology that exists, sort of the font of this technology is privacy and decentralization, and those tools, right? They could be used to, if you believe that privacy and decentralization are important, can be used to great ends, as Bitcoin exemplifies, but they can also be corrupted and used as a surveillance system. And I think there is a real danger that certain countries in particular are going to use this amazing technology, not for the revolutionary purposes that I described in that imagined slide, but for the purpose of controlling all of the financial transactions in an economy. And to me, that is a very bad thing. It's not something that I look forward to.
Thanks a lot for this question, for the answering of the question. I got already some questions here in the chat, which I would like to forward
Sure.
to you. So one interesting question is actually, what happens to the digital assets if someone dies?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
What happens to the digital assets if someone dies?
Yeah, that's interesting. So let me back up and just give you a little explainer on what these digital assets are, or even what a Bitcoin is, right? And so Bitcoin, I use the phrase UTXO, but it's basically a message. It's a message that we attribute value to, and consider it like a series of lockboxes, where if I want to send Stephan, I want to send you a Bitcoin, I describe. As I'm sending it to you, I don't know that I'm doing this, but when I send, say send a Bitcoin to Stephan's address, what I'm doing is I'm saying lock it to Stephan's address, and only the person that has the key to that lockbox, you, Stephan, only the person who has the key to unlock that address and send it forward can unlock it and send it forward. So what would happen upon someone's death? Well, hopefully, if someone passes away and has a large number of blockchain assets or Bitcoin in their possession, they would have a plan to provide those keys to the lockboxes to their heirs. whoever possesses those keys has full and complete dominion and control over those assets. So even theft and loss, you know, if you lose those keys, if you put those keys on the internet, someone can immediately steal your Bitcoin. Possession of the keys equals possession of the ability to spend it forward to the next lockbox. So the short answer to your question is, if I were to pass away, I actually have a plan for my wife and my children to have access to those keys, and it's critically important. Now, if you don't self-custody, if you use a service like Coinbase, and I didn't really mention this, there are different services out there that will custody your Bitcoin for you. They'll hold the keys, and if you use one of those systems, then who knows? You have to read the terms and conditions of your relationship, because that relationship, just like a banking relationship, is an unsecured obligation. You don't own the Bitcoin that are sitting on Coinbase. Coinbase owns those Bitcoin. They can rehypothecate it, which means basically they can fractionally reserve it. They can use it for different purposes. They can put it on their general balance sheet and use it. And your only right is basically to say, please, can I have my Bitcoin back? And if they say no, then guess what? Run into New York Supreme Court or California state court and fight the good fight to get it back from them, because that's all an unsecured obligation means. It means the right to sue.
Okay,
make sense?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
I got a question from Joseph Timmins. He asks if you could explain the proof of work concept versus the proof of stake as a Bitcoin mining option.
Yeah, I'd love to. And Tron is the best person. He just spoke to my class a few weeks ago. He's the best person to explain this distinction, but I'll try my best. So proof of work is mining, which is what we talked about before. And it's a system that and I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of it, but it's a system that you try to solve a mathematical problem that is very difficult to solve, but very, very easy to verify. And miners compete with each other to solve this problem. The solution to which locks a group of transactions called a block on the blockchain. Let's back up for a second. What is a blockchain? A blockchain is a chain of digital signatures that are recorded in these things called blocks. So you have multiple transactions that miners pull together, and they build them up into this block structure, and then they chain through this proof of work. They chain one block to the next. That's what a blockchain is. That's what the ledger is, a chain of blocks. Miners are the ones that do the chaining. So proof of work is the Satoshi system. It wasn't invented by Satoshi. It was actually invented by a person by the name of Adam Back. Satoshi used this concept to create the ability to chain blocks together, to timestamp blocks together in a way that can't be, that as you get more and more blocks and more work stacked on top of each other, that makes it more difficult over time to unwind something that was previously recorded as a transaction, double spent. So that's proof of work. That was Satoshi's solution. Proof of stake is an entirely different system. It's a system that chains the blocks together using sort of a validation system that is based upon financial risk. So you place, in the Ethereum context, you place your Ethereum basically into a vault. And if you do something that makes the transaction invalid, or you do bad things, you're not recording the ledger appropriately, you get slashed. You get some of those funds that you put up there, that you staked, that you risked, you get those funds taken away. So that's an incentive mechanism. The incentive is not to do that because you would lose what you had to stake. That's the basic difference between proof of work and proof of stake. There are two different validation mechanisms used to chain blocks together on a blockchain.
Okay, great. Yes, thanks. Another question by Adrian Rostrom. How is the cost of maintaining the system actually supported? Costs like transaction costs, handling fees?
So yeah, good question. And I didn't mention this when I was talking about proof of work. The reason miners do proof of work is because, and they expend a lot of energy to do it, a lot of, to solve that problem that I told you about, it takes a lot of computation. And they do it, it costs money. and electricity costs money, and the miners cost money, the chips cost money. And the reason miners do it is because if they win, if they solve that problem, and they actually get the transactions in the block that they have packaged together onto the blockchain as the next block, they get a reward. So that reward is what incentivizes these miners, and I'm one of them. I have a miner sitting right here, actually. You know, that's what incentivizes these miners to provide this validation service. It's basically a service. Interestingly, the Bitcoin model is, you know, when these new coins are created, these, you know, this reward goes to the miners. It's issuing new Bitcoin into the system. That's how you get to the 21 million Bitcoin. It started with zero Bitcoin in the system. Satoshi Nakamoto mined the first block and got the block reward. That was the first Bitcoin that ever entered the system. And from that day to this, Bitcoin has been entering the system through these mining rewards. And they go down over time. So it's just part of the system. So as they go down and down and down and down, and they approach, you know, zero mining rewards, theoretically, the price of Bitcoin will continue to rise. So the incentive is still there. Even if you have fewer Bitcoin coming out as a mining reward, you have higher dollars coming out as a mining reward. But at some point in time, right, the curves are going to cross. Mining rewards are going to be so low that transaction fees are going to be sort of the basis for miner incentives. So what does that mean? The mining reward springs forth from the system. But transaction fees are actually paid by the participants. So the Alices and the Bobs of the world, when they send a transaction, they sort of cleave off a little piece and they say, okay, thank you very much, miners, for processing this transaction. Here you go. Here's a little piece. It's called the transaction fee. Over time, those transaction fees will start to more and more support, theoretically, more and more support the support miners in this validation function, incentivize miners for this validation function. That's what I meant by curves crossing. You know, at some point, miner rewards are going to go down like this, and transaction fees are going to go up like this. But I'm sorry, one more thing, Stephan. I think we will find that, you know, when that day comes in 2044 or whatever, that we'll start to see more and more Bitcoin be used more and more as a net settlement layer for very large transactions. When I showed you that big Fed ledger, right? The Fed doesn't tick and tie every balance sheet for every bank. They net settle the financial system. And Bitcoin, in many respects, could become such a system where it's really net settling massive, you know, financial transactions from not the Alices and the Bobs of the world, but from the, you know, Citibanks and the JP Morgans of the world. So, you know, transaction fees would clearly support that sort of, you know, would support that sort of very large financial transaction.
But even in this environment, I mean, at some point, due to the limitation of available Bitcoins, liquidity would dry up at some point, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, Bitcoin is now being used, and I don't know if this is because of, you know, how Bitcoin is taxed, or if it's just inherent in the system. But Bitcoin really is used right now as a value store. It's not used as a liquid instrument. Now there is, you know, the Lightning Network, which we haven't gotten into, but it's a sort of an add-on to the Bitcoin network that allows very cheap transactions to person-to-person, very cheap transactions, and those net settle on the Bitcoin blockchain. You know, so that provides more liquidity to the system. It's not more Bitcoin, but it, you know, it's sort of a cheaper mechanism for passing Bitcoin around. But yeah, no, Bitcoin is a value store. It's being used currently as a value store. I use it as a value store, but that doesn't mean you can't use it to conduct transactions. I mean, I can pick up my phone, and Stephan, I can send you wherever you may be. I can send you a Bitcoin, and I can even use Lightning to do it on Twitter, and send you a Bitcoin from wherever I am to wherever you are, almost instantly, and it's you know, very low cost.
There's a question from Patrick Sorensen, which fits perfectly to what we were just discussing. He asks, how are we going to actually get into a world with only decentralized ledgers in 25 to 30 years, like you said? It's going to take a few major companies to start transitioning to using exclusively cryptocurrencies first.
Yeah, I agree. But look at the progress that's been made since 2008. There is a country right now using Bitcoin as its monetary instrument. Who would have thought of that 4 years ago? And people have a perception of Bitcoin still, and I never had this perception personally, because I saw the benefits of this decentralized ledger concept right away. It sort of hit me like a lightning bolt, but it doesn't hit everyone. And so the perception out there of Bitcoin, and it's still being perpetrated by some folks who are politicians and others, is that it's only used for drugs, and it's only used for I've been in this space for going on 5 years now, and I've never seen anybody do a drug transaction using Bitcoin. I have seen people do very valuable things with Bitcoin, and there are companies that are adopting it and putting it on their balance sheet. MicroStrategy is one. There are nations that are using it. But so the short answer to that question, though, is yeah, more adoption will happen over time, and I think we're going to start to see this era of the decentralized ledger really come to fruition, because it makes sense. Those big buildings I talked about in New York, they are funded by skimming little fractions of all of the transactions that we all do. And it's a valuable system right now. And the reason it's a valuable system is because we needed that. We needed trusted third parties to keep those ledgers before. There was no other way to do it unless you use something hard and fixed supply like gold. So Bitcoin was the first opportunity for us to be able to sort of get rid of those middlemen. I read this tweet the other day and it really hit home with me. It was somebody talking about Western Union transactions, sending people who live in the United States sending money back to their family in El Salvador, and Western Union takes up to 30% of those transactions. And the only thing Western Union does is they sort of record a debit over here and record a credit over here, and then net settle it through their banks. And guess what? You can send a Bitcoin now without them. Goodbye, Western Union. We do not need you anymore. That's 18th century technology that's been supplanted now by 21st century technology.
A question by Dave Canary. What's the potential impact of proliferation of cryptocurrencies?
Potential impact of
cryptocurrencies, because since we see more and more cryptocurrencies emerging, what do you think about the market? What will happen with the market?
So there is competition in the space for different functionality. So Bitcoin was the first, but there are clearly other cryptocurrencies that exist. Some of them have privacy features, so they may have a use case that people appreciate. Some of them have faster transactions. Litecoin is an example. Some of them have cheaper transactions. Some of them can do other things, like Ravencoin Ravencoin itself is a cryptocurrency, but it's got one major principal use, which is that you can use that cryptocurrency to make those things, those blockchain assets we talked about. So, a large number of cryptos exist. Many of them, I think, will die and just go extinct. And maybe a few of them that have real and legitimate use cases will stick around. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin was first and probably best at this notion of, and the reason it's best is because of the security properties. The mining base, the security that Bitcoin has it surpasses all other blockchains by multiples. So that's one of the things, and I talked about driving demand before. That's one of the reasons one would demand a Bitcoin, and it's because Bitcoin has the greatest security of any blockchain in existence. But look, these are free markets, and if another blockchain does come along and it's got better properties and people start to use it, then those value decisions are the things that are going to drive which blockchain ends up surviving as the blockchain. I'm not an adherent to the notion that there has to be one blockchain. I think different blockchains can do different things, and what Bitcoin currently does best is store and allow you to transact in value.
Okay. Yes. Chris Sire asks, where's the best place to incorporate a blockchain or a DeFi company?
Yeah, I mean, that gets into legal issues, and I don't want to give legal advice, so I'm not going to say the best place to incorporate, but I can tell you this, and I have a little anecdote that I can tie this into, but Wyoming in the United States of America is sort of the most forward-thinking state currently for blockchain. They passed in 2017 and 2018, passed a number of laws that I would describe as enabling legislation. Some restrictions, but really sort of went out of their way to foster blockchain incorporation, and they've now they created essentially a blockchain bank, a regulatory system for a blockchain bank to exist, and there currently is a blockchain bank called Avanti. So I would say Wyoming is probably a place you would want to look if you were considering incorporating. It doesn't have the same degree of sort of history that Delaware does for just general corporation law issues. And I'll tell you the anecdote. The anecdote is, and I teach this in my class, when you look at the regulatory environment right now in the blockchain space, you have sort of a pendulum. On the one hand, you've got the states like Wyoming that are really trying to foster and encourage blockchain and its uses. And you've got states like New York, my beloved New York, which is the worst state in the union for blockchain. They have a regulation called the bit license. It's almost impossible to follow. It's very difficult to get. If you have a startup and you want to do Bitcoin things in New York, good luck to you, because your legal costs are going to exceed the value of your startup, which is why not many companies actually act out of New York. I live in New Jersey. I take a ferry into New York City. When I cross the cell tower with my phone from the New Jersey side to the New York side, as soon as the cell tower switches, many blockchain companies that I use shut off. And they say not accessible from your state. That's just two different ways to approach it. One is sort of from a perspective of fear, and the other sort of from a perspective of encouragement. And the anecdote I use is from sort of the first example of enabling legislation, which is corporations. My great state of New Jersey was the center of corporate law in America in the latter half of the 1800s. And the reason was because previously corporations were disfavored, and you needed a special piece of legislation from your state legislature in order to incorporate a corporation. You actually had to know a state senator or someone, and they would give you a special bill just for your corporation. And that's because they were disfavored. New Jersey passed the first corporate enabling legislation. It allowed what's called a general corporation, not a special corporation, not one that was specifically approved by the legislature, but a general corporation. And New Jersey passed the first general corporation statute. Most of the big corporations in America then rose up and started to incorporate themselves in New Jersey. And we still have remnants of them, to this day. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey has become mobile, which is still incorporated in the state. But interestingly, what New Jersey did about 10 years later was Woodrow Wilson rose to prominence in New Jersey politics and became the governor of New Jersey, and passed through the legislature a series of a progressive agenda generally. But one of the things that Wilson was keen on was this sort of anti-corporate agenda, and passed a series of laws called the Seven Sisters. I don't know why, to this day, I don't know why it's called the Seven Sisters, but they were anti-corporate rules. And at the same time, Delaware had opened its books with its enabling legislation, which we now know as the Delaware General Corporation Law. And guess what happened? All DuPont incorporated in Delaware, and then all of the major corporations started to flock to Delaware. So what do we see now when we look around the world? We see a tiny state that's a thoroughfare between New York and Washington, D.C., that is the center of corporate law in the United States for certain, and one can comfortably say in the world. All big corporations are incorporated in Delaware. And that's just a difference, one switch in legislative approach, in regulatory approach, from enabling to restricting in one state that already had, was the first mover and had all the corporations there, and boom, they went down to Delaware, and here we are. If you talk about corporate law, you talk about Delaware law. So we're getting to see the same thing happening in the blockchain space in real time. You've got the restrictive approach of New York, you've got the open approach of Wyoming and Florida, and to some degree Texas, and you're starting to see shifts. You're seeing companies go to Wyoming, companies go down to Miami, companies go down to Texas, and you're also starting to see companies going to countries that are sort of opening their books for these types of businesses like El Salvador.
We got a general question on the limitation. Again, it's referring to the limitation of Bitcoins, the limited number of Bitcoins.
Yeah.
So does that mean that there is a limit on the number of transactions that can take place through Bitcoin? In other words, when the last Bitcoin is mined, does that mean that some other blockchain must be used for the transactions?
No, no. And the reason is because the number of Bitcoins Bitcoins are divisible. And down to 8 decimal places at Satoshis, and you can transact in those Bitcoins. The day that 21 million Bitcoins is all the Bitcoins that exist, all of those 21 million Bitcoins and the fractions of them can transact through the system. So you wouldn't need to have another blockchain. It's a good question though.
Another question is from Chris. Do you see people being able to vote from their kitchen table someday?
I would like to see that, but we're not there. When I was introduced, I said, I have a patent pending voting system. So, my system is both. And folks will tell me in the blockchain space will tell me that, it's superfluous to have a paper record. And then people in the voting space will tell you, you must absolutely have a paper record. But are anti-blockchain. I think blockchain brings the best of all worlds. So you can have a blockchain voting system. You have a fully auditable blockchain-based electronic decentralized paper trail in quotes. But I think, in this transition period, we would also need, a paper-based system to act as a cross-check. Because it's interesting when you see something, there's something called a reorg in the blockchain space, and I've seen them, I've witnessed them happen. And when you have a reorganization in the blockchain space on a blockchain, what happens is what previously was the history suddenly disappears, and that disappearance propagates itself to all of the nodes. So when you're looking at your node, you can't tell that it's been reorged unless you see it right in front of your face happening. I think there's danger in that. If we had a purely blockchain-based voting system that people were using on their phones, it would have to be a level of security that I don't think currently exists in the blockchain space.
We definitely wouldn't have the problem of voter identification then.
Look, the blockchain is the best way to record a ledger on a decentralized basis, in history. And we've got all of these county clerks that are using these antiquated systems tallying up our votes. It's really tragic to watch. I can tell you if I send a Bitcoin, when it got locked on the blockchain, the address that I sent it from and the address that I sent it to. And I can tell you that from any number of external systems, from a node, from using a blockchain explorer. I have no idea, zero idea, if any of the votes that I have cast since the age of 18 have ever made their way into the tally. It's the only thing. You go to the store and you buy a pack of bubble gum and they give you a thing called a receipt, which you can then use to prove that you actually purchased this bubble gum for 22 cents. I have nothing that shows me what my vote was. I have nothing that proves to me that my vote was tallied. Having voters have the ability to verify votes for themselves would eliminate many of the issues that we've had. And my voting system predated the last election, but and it sort of arose out of my head before blockchain existed, post Bush v. Gore. And I'll tell you, we need a system. In my opinion, this is just an opinion, but we need such a system where voters can independently verify their votes. It's the only important thing that we do that you can't verify for yourself.
The question is, on the other hand, this raises other problems then regarding privacy, because of course...
privacy and vote buying.
Yep.
Yeah, privacy and vote buying. I say vote buying is far less of a problem than vote tallies not being accurate.
Okay.
And less full choices. So when I weigh those, I come out in favor of knowing that the votes are cast and recorded properly.
Probably, yes. There's another question by Sharon Driscoll. What is the difference between a blockchain bank and a trust bank? What is the function of the blockchain bank?
Yeah, very similar. So the system in Wyoming is sort of a one-to-one, no rehypothecation. That what's in the vault is what's recorded on the ledger. So it's very similar to a trust company in that respect.
Okay.
Yeah, trust companies differ depending on your jurisdiction, but a classic trust company with a one-to-one relationship between assets and liabilities is a pretty accurate description of what's going on in these blockchain banks.
Great, thanks a lot. We have 3 minutes left. So if someone has a question, you may also raise your hand if you don't want to type something in the chat. I can unmute you in case you want to ask Doug something. So just let me know. Let's see if the questions are popping in. Otherwise, I
think we've got one here from Hassani.
Yes.
I can't read it, so if you wouldn't mind.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for the information. I just follow up on Stephan's question. In terms of confidentiality and the security of information, we know that blockchain is helping us. And my question would be, how much do you see this? And those elements that can be considered as a threat for the blockchain, do you think there are some? And if so, what are those?
So, good question. Blockchain is a technology, and it's a useful technology. But it's a technology that needs space to grow. And it's a technology that comes from principles, right? You know, these principles we've talked about, these principles of privacy and peer-to-peer transactions and decentralized ledger keeping. That's the essence, the core of what a blockchain is, what Bitcoin is. And to my mind, the biggest threat to that is ham-handed regulation. When you get regulatory regimes or systems like we have in New York, I mean, imagine in 1998, if an internet news publication, right at the origin of the .com era, right? Before we were all talking on glass screen phones and tweeting and all of that stuff. I mean, remember back when we were using Control-C and Control-V on our Windows computers at home and, CompuServe. And imagine if you applied the regulations that were put in place for the largest financial institutions in the world over a period of many, many decades, the big banks, and all of the securities regulations, so the SEC, all of the commodities regulations, the CFTC, and regulated every transaction as a taxable event, which the IRS has done. And then require everybody who uses the system to log in with through a federal system, requiring them to show their passport or their driver's license and provide their identity. That's KYC at the federal level. And then imagine if you also required people when they logged into this CompuServe system to satisfy the companies that did this to satisfy each of the 50 states' varying regulations on securities and money transmission and KYC. These are massive regulatory regimes being applied to companies that are startups. If we did that in 1999 in the internet context, we would not be talking, my view is we would not be talking to each other over the Zoom right now. And I wouldn't have a glass phone that I can communicate with anybody all over the world. That's, that kind of approach that, regulate first, ask questions later approach, to me is the biggest risk to blockchain. The second biggest risk to blockchain is it will come from countries like China, right? So what has China done over the past several years? First, they banned mining. Bitcoin mining is banned in China. China was the biggest Bitcoin mining location in the world. Now I think it's Texas, but Bitcoin mining was just banned. When countries take that sort of approach, I don't know out of fear or what, but take an approach that this is a bad thing that we need to squash, then that has the potential to really damage the growth of the system. Will it kill Bitcoin? No, Bitcoin exists. Bitcoin will survive. It's designed to survive. The purpose of those decentralized nodes is to allow transactions to happen without anybody being able to censor them or step in the middle of them and stop them. So, but that, to me, that's the biggest danger to the growth of the space. I would like to see more enabling legislation. People commit crime. They commit crime using Bitcoin. They commit crime using dollars. People use good tools for illicit ends all the time. The 9/11 hijackers took showers. We don't ban water. We need to, have reasonable regulation, but and a reasonable approach to regulation. But I would prefer if the approach came from a point of view of enabling the good parts of this technology. Because as you've seen, I did the presentation. I mean, you've seen what it can do. It is the first system in history that allows you to send something from person to person without anybody being able to stop it, or anybody being able to censor it, or anybody asking anyone's permission. You do not need someone's permission to send a Bitcoin. You need permission to send a wire transfer.
One last question, a quick one. How long do you think it will take for Bitcoin to become mainstream?
It's getting there. I think it's almost there. Rapid growth since 2017. Sort of simmering growth in the early years of Bitcoin, and then sort of, went from real cryptographic hobbyists to, sort of regular users who were still very sort of keen on these cryptographic issues and the sort of the principles of decentralization. Now you're starting to see a massive influx of people. I'd say in the past year or so, you're starting to see companies adopt it, put it on their balance sheet. Someday soon we'll have a spot ETF for Bitcoin. So you'll start to see regulated financial institutions get into the game. My prediction is, 2-3 years, and it's really going to be very mainstream.
One more
I used
question.
to give this talk, by the way, Stephan,
Yep.
and I'd say I opened it with how many people have heard of Bitcoin, and everybody would raise their hand. And I'd say, how many people have actually used Bitcoin? Everybody would put their hand down. And, the more and more I do these talks, the more and more the hands stay up. And it's interesting to see. So in my class, for example, it's the first question I ask. And nowadays it's, this class this year, and pretty much, 8 out of 10 of the hands stayed up.
Yeah. I think the last question for today, couldn't the central bank block currency conversions to crypto?
Yes, that's one of those risks.
Yeah.
Right? Yes, the government could ban the use of Bitcoin, ban people from using Bitcoin. Now that wouldn't stop Bitcoin from existing. It would still exist. But sure, a government could tell you that you are not allowed to use that product. And you would have a choice as to whether you did or didn't abide by that law. But governments can regulate individuals.
Doug, thanks a lot. I think we are already over time. I will hand over to Kyle. Thanks a lot for the discussion and the presentation.
Yeah, outstanding. I really enjoyed having this talk, and I wish I could have gotten to know some of you in person. I see all the faces here, and I appreciate you all, taking the time to listen to me. And I hope now that when you read, new things about blockchain in the press and you hear people talk about it, you have a little bit of a context that you can put it into, because it's really quite amazing technology, and it's still very much in its infancy, but it is the future. And I think that statement will be borne out over the next decade or so.
Well, I want to thank Doug and Stephan. You can join me in, a virtual clap and a virtual thumbs up, or whatever you want to do on your Zoom screen there. So thanks also to all of you for your thoughtful questions and comments that you had. And the Center for Ethics in Society will be hosting more in-person events for those of you in the Greater Manchester area. And we'll have plenty more online events planned in the coming semester. So please pay attention to your email, to our website for upcoming events. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.